The early days, oh, a better nation, fair and free, Scotland.
Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast, episode number 122. First things first, I'd just like to say thank you to the people who've donated recently to help the podcast along. If you'd also like to do that, you can find the donate button at michaelgreenwell.wordpress.com. And secondly, the post below this on the website, there's a little documentary I was involved in by Phantom Power, talking about how to make a podcast yourself. If you're interested in that, have a little look at it. And now to today's guest. This time I spoke with Robert Somynne. Robert is a writer, blogger and poet, and after he moved up from down south, he joined the Scottish Independence campaign and remains firmly a supporter of Scottish independence. So here's the conversation I had with Robert. Hope you enjoy it. Hi Robert, how's it going?
Oh, it's fine, thanks.
Had a good weekend? Done anything interesting?
Yeah. I've actually I went to this archery competition and training in Haddington. Actually, it's quite good. Yeah, one of my few passions.
Yeah, I've tried it once. It's bloody hard, actually.
It is. Yeah, it takes a bit of a toll on the old back. Yeah.
I tried it in actually in a jungle village in Nepal.
Oh.
And I couldn't do it. I couldn't make the thing go more than 5 meters. And these guys were shooting the thing 100 meters perfectly. It was amazing. The mad thing, though, was that they had a kind of target over on the next kind of hill over. And the guy who retrieves the arrows sitting sort of 2 meters away from the target going, oh, that was a good shot. It just missed me. Hit the target, but great shot.
Oh, that's good though. You got to put the shooter under pressure. It brings out the best in you.
Okay, so I asked you on because I'm someone I enjoy your blog, I enjoy the writing and the output you put out there, but I'm sure some of the listeners will know who you are and some of them aren't. So we just do a bit of backstory here. So where were you from originally and why did you decide to come to Scotland? And then we'll get into the political side later.
Okay, so yeah, my name's Robert Somynne, and I used to live in London, born and bred, and I kind of came from a sort of a Labour unionist position in my terms of my politics, very much a believer in the idea of cool Britannia and a sort of diverse British identity. I had published quite a few poems. I used to work in sort of Labour communications, PR, and it really came, around about the time of the referendum that I started reading up more on, Scottish history, whether that's modern political history or contemporary politics, the mechanics of Holyrood, and just the contemporary debate. And I kind of came from a perspective initially when I was down in London of thinking, okay, this is going to be a great opportunity. The Scottish National Party are going to provide an impetus for the forces of British federalism to come up with a creative solution to the imbalance of power within the British states. And I waited and waited and waited and realised it wasn't coming. But also I had quite a few friends who were in the SNP, quite a few friends who were generally on the left in Scotland, and just through small conversations with them, I started realising that I shared a lot of their beliefs, that Scotland was a place that was, it was small as a political community, and that was its strength. There was an opportunity to change things and to forge something new, create a nation, build a nation from scratch, and that's something that really attracted me. At the same time, I was training to be a primary school teacher just when the negotiations to set the date of the referendum was happening. And so I moved up from England generally because the situation for teaching down there was becoming a lot more target driven, and I was very attracted to teaching in Scotland and the whole educational developments that are happening up here. So that's one of the reasons why two of the reasons why I moved up. It's just the political climate and sort of professional reasons really. And I'd been writing a blog when I was down in London that was mostly about poetry and politics and Labour politics. And as soon as I started reading what was going on with the referendum, it just lit a light switch in my head. I suddenly realised this is where real intellectual commitment comes from. This is real intellectual vigour, and started writing about all kinds of things to do with Scotland and identity and how I felt about Scottishness and Britishness. How we could actually change the country.
Just before you moved up to Scotland, how did you feel about, because you could give a lot of the listeners a unique perspective on this, because how did you feel about the debate that was going on down in London before you moved up? Because you said you had contacts with people, you had friends with people in the SNP and so on. But down in London, or like if you look at sort of the Independent articles and the Guardian articles from the time, it was, oh, these poor idiots, how could they even think about it? There was that kind of element, and or betraying the British populace, that sort of idea. And then there was a kind of Quentin Letts, good riddance, sod off, sweaty sock kind of stuff as well. How did it appear to you down there before you came up?
And I think it was a question of perspective. It's the most similar thing I can relate it to is, I went to university in York, and so I was coming from a very kind of London suburban outlook, and I had the same kind of feelings about the North. And, total ignorance. Didn't really understand. I understood the politics, but I didn't really get why a lot of people in the North were frustrated about lack of investment, about lack of political power and identity. And when you actually go somewhere and you talk to people, you realize how much of an illusion is developed in the South, in the center of power, where you are so far away from where the action's actually happening. So for me, when it came to the Scottish debate, it was just complete ignorance. It's having never spoke to people who are actually involved in the country's future and in the national debate, because it's a question of perspective. You're down in London. What matters is London life and London politics, and who's going to hold the balance of power in Westminster within that system. Politics by nature is very stale, but it's its own kind of reality, a kind of parallel reality where the only thing that matters is what's happening at the centre. And for me, coming from sort of a Labour federalist perspective, my initial reaction was one of, this is absolute betrayal. How could they do this? What's wrong with them? And then you actually speak to people. And I have to credit, so many of those friends who had small little conversations with me, just logical conversations where they would put scenarios to me of, imagine this was your country, imagine this had happened to you, and imagine this was the state of economic relations and investment and the political structures. How would you feel? And it seemed utterly illogical to me when it was explained to me in that way. But it's a question of perspective. And a lot of people, I think the vast majority of people, don't actually have the kind of Quentin Letts, well, they can just bugger off anyway attitude. There is a sizable minority, but I think the vast majority of instinctively are, Britain is fantastic, we're better together, and you just accept that because that's the only thing you've ever known. That's the only perspective you've ever known. And it takes an individual having that conversation or set of conversations with you to make you think about it anew.
I mean, I remember a couple of conversations in the pub around the time of the Indyref. There was a few English guys there, and obviously everyone's talking about the referendum at that particular moment in time. And we got talking to these guys, and they were saying, we thought it was just because everyone up here hated us. And, people were saying, no, it's not like that at all. It was basically, we want to change this here. That will give the shock to the British state that will then give you the opportunity to change things down south as well. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked out so far, but who knows where it will go next. But so the next question is, when you got here and that referendum period was in full flow, how did you get involved and how did you feel about that compared to the normal sort of run-of-the-mill stale politics that you described before?
Well, it was coming into contact with organisations like Commonweal, sort of individuals in sort of the SNP and local branches, sort of yes movements, artists, especially thinking about those who had created and brought together lots of national collective events. That was incredible because it was a political movement that actually was a movement. It was alive. It was made of people. And it was a shock to the system because you didn't realize how stale politics is in England at the moment. And I sort of come at things from a historical perspective. So the way I feel about it is, England's got a rich tradition of radical movements with people actually going out, doing grassroots work, setting up local sort of political groups, activists, artists. But behind that movement in Scotland, what I could clearly see when I came up was a rich history of people doing that, and a sort of a populace that was aware of its own history. That history is made by common people who come together in common association and do a wide variety of things. whether that's knowledge of the Radicals' war or the heritage passed down by the Covenanters, that idea of an active populace and citizenry of common people. That for me was a massive difference coming across one nation which the debate is dormant and where politics is something which is the exercise of the elite and it's the preserve of people who have power and everyone else is just sort of scampering around to survive. And in Scotland, where there is already this shock where it's in sort of the bloodstream of the people to get up and do something, it always made me think of Alistair Gray in Lanark, where he says that comment where he says, you make the biggest mistake in politics. You think that talking to leaders can affect changes. Leaders are the effects of changes and not the cause of changes. First you need a groundswell of consciousness on the ground. People need to think differently, need to think new about themselves before you can start to see that change happening out on the streets. And the first thing that I noticed coming to Scotland was the fact that people were very open as well. They'd come up to you and say, why don't you come along to a meeting? And that meeting could be a cinema screening of a particular Scottish play or a Scottish independent film. You might go to a random literary book meeting in Dundee, and there'd be someone there who's involved in the Yes movement, and then they link you onto someone else. So I think it's a combination of the fact that you had so many people in the arts, literature, design, fashion, art, and the original political parties who just wanted to get out there and do something physical. And that, for me, goes back to a tradition that's quite rich in Scotland's history that's kind of missing or dormant in England. And that was the massive difference. That's what really, really shocked me.
The involvement. And I think there was a lot of people that got involved for the first time as well during that period. They'd never been involved before, but they felt that the issue was so important that they had to get involved.
Yeah, it was that kind of awakened sense of importance, that sense of urgency. And I think that's the greatest thing about even going up to now. It's been a year and a half after the referendum. People still care, and that's for me is the big success. Yeah, it was a no vote by a slim majority, but people care enough to still be enthused about those issues. The issue hasn't gone away, and even though there's a sense of fatigue, that's the biggest legacy of the referendum movement. It's now people have got into politics for the first time. They're not going to get out of it. You don't fall out of a situation like that or a state of consciousness like that.
And it's amazing because it's still holding up. In fact, the independence vote is even increasing in most of the polls when you consider that the Better Together campaign hasn't stopped either. There's just a constant barrage in the media. SNP bad, Scottish Labour constantly digging their own hole with that. I'll ask you later on about if you did PR with Labour, how you feel about Scottish Labour's PR. No, I'll ask you that now, actually. They're fantastic, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have this deep feeling that someone in their PR team actually works for the SNP. It's obvious that they must work for the SNP. There's no other explanation, really. That was another thing, though. Coming from a sort of Labour London perspective, you have this sort of weird attitude towards Scottish Labour or kind of socialism within Scotland or social democracy or the general left in Scotland, which is this is where it began. So we were completely clueless about how poor Scottish Labour were in terms of their hierarchical structure, their poor messaging, their total lack of direction. So I came up and I thought, well, this is where Labour began. The Labour Party may be stale in England, but Scotland they're going to have dynamism. And then I actually just encountered how piss poor they were, and it came as a real shock to see a party that had become so self-vacillating, had become the party of power, the party of static power as well. And what I really noticed was that there'd been this draining of talent from Scottish Labour that had been happening for generations. And you saw it when you looked at the SNP or you looked at other parties. I still say this to friends in England when they ask me and they're so shocked about what's happened to Scottish Labour, and I say, look, if you're looking for the people that would have given Scottish Labour any degree of dynamism, you have to look at the other parties in Scotland. You have to look at the SNP, especially a lot of the young people in the SNP. That's where that inheritance has gone. The Scottish Labour talk about the SNP stealing their clothes. Well, if you want to strip down and run around naked talking about rampant free marketism, then someone's going to step into your clothes and take your inheritance, and quite rightly. But from a sort of communications and PR perspective, I think that loss of young blood is related to the fact